Oh, pardon me. My, well, this is going to be a long process with recovery here. Now, I may have to cut this recording session short today on the feast of the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But I will go on and do as many as I can today right now. I have a big talk with Adam. This aging process. Healing doesn't occur as quickly in your 7th decade as when you're younger. Deo gratias. My sins deserve this. All to thee, Blessed Mother, all to thy sorrowful and immaculate heart. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, we love these safe souls. We love these safe souls. Now, all right, let me go on. This is now, I think, the 23rd presentation of the Living in the Shadow of the Cross lecture programs. And what I want to concentrate on today, in this presentation rather, in these 25 or 30 minutes, is on the settlement of the English colonies in contradistinction to the Catholic colonies of Latin America and French America, to Spain to France. Now, again, this is just a summary and overview. A lot more is in conversion in reverse. And my writing online, the work of others, I'll be citing one in particular right now. So when a phone comes in handy, when you've left notes at home that you need. So my phone is very handy here right now. So please pardon me while I look at this device, which I don't really like. I am not very technologically savvy. I use it, but I'm not very good with it. And I hate texting. I'm a good typist, except I make typographical errors. That's who I am. I'm sorry. If I make it to purgatory, I'll spend my purgatory, I am sure, besides suffering the flames of purgatory, correcting my typographical errors, every single one of them, which means I might be there. Please God, I die in a state of grace until the end of time. So get me out. If those of you listening watching this, I die and you survive me, please pray for me. I have masses offered, true masses offered for me by true priests. Please, have my immortal soul. As I noted at the end of the last presentation, there's a great deal of mythology concerning the founding of the English colonies. The English settlers who came to Virginia, came for no religious purpose at all. They came for commercial purposes. In 1607, when the first permanent English settlement was established at Jamestown, Virginia. It was purely for secular commercial reasons. In time, churches would spring up, heretical churches would spring up in English colonies. But the English came here for purely commercial reasons, not for reasons of evangelization. They weren't here to convert the Indians. Oh, they would deal with them. They would trade with them. They would not, for the most part, have much else to do with them. Now, the Spanish did come here for a variety of reasons as well, to be sure. A lot of them were intent on the gold. And there was conflict between the French missionaries frequently and some of the French explorers and the Spanish missionaries and the Spanish conquistadores and the Spanish landowners. St. Peter Claver, with his own hands, personally baptized over 300,000 African slaves who were sold into slavery, but was captured, brought to the coast by they were either the losers in intra-tribal warfare or inter-tribal warfare, or criminals brought to the coast by their tribal leaders either their own or those who had captured them and sold into slavery, because whites did not go into the interior of Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries, or the 17th and then the early 18th centuries. These slaves were these individuals, human beings, were brought to the coast and then sold into slavery. Chattel slavery, which Holy Mother Church condemned. St. Peter Claver personally baptized with his own hands 300,000 Africans who were destined for the slavery of this life, but he freed them first of all from the slavery to the devil by means of original sin. St. Francis Solano survived a shipwreck which drowned some Africans who were destined for slavery and in South America. And St. Francis Solano baptized them all before they died, before that ship capsized and they drowned. And so they were freed from captivity to the devil in this life and freed by God. Since they were made his children, they were closer to God than the angels at that point. They were freed from having to slave under chattel slavery in this life. So they're freed from the devil in this life and freed as well from chattel slavery. I mean, the merciful God, the hands of these great missionaries. St. Peter Claver, the great Jesuit. For Francis Solano, the Franciscan. The English came here for commercial reasons. And they would trade with the Indians, they would ally with them, or they would kill them, depending upon what suited their purposes. The first English who came here came to these shores for specific religious purposes were not members of the Anglican sect or anyone interested in proselytizing, that is, spreading Anglicanism. No. That was never a mission of the English settlers, was to convert the heathens. The first ones to come here in 1620 were, of course, the Pilgrims, who were, as I explained before, everything in these lectures ultimately tied together, were Calvinist separationists, those who desired a complete separation from the Church of England, so-called Church of England, the heretical, schismatic Church of England, which they believed had retained too much of the Catholic trappings, whereas the Puritans wanted to stay within the structures and work to change, to Calvinize, if you will, to make Calvinist the Anglican Church from within, the Anglican sect from within. So some of these pilgrims went to Holland when they were being persecuted in England at the beginning of the 17th century. And finding Holland not to their liking, some of those separationists stayed. The Dutch Reformed Church had a number of English exiles, but some of the English separatists, the Pilgrim separatists, returned to England and set sail for the New World. Now, their original destination, to found a settlement in the New World. Their original destination was Virginia, but they had Gilligan at the helm, which Ollie G. skipper, and they wound up blown off course in Massachusetts. Now, one of the lines I would use in my classrooms at this point when I taught this, and I taught every bit of this in my classrooms, is that you couldn't do some of this today, I know that, which is why, again, I'm not teaching anywhere these days. The Pilgrims were met by a young man named Kennedy, who offered to take them in a buggy ride over a bridge at Chappaquiddick Island. Anyhow, that in the 70s, that would get a little bit of a recognition. By the 80s, late 80s, 90s, Chappa who? Didn't know anything. But they landed in Massachusetts, what is now they call the Plymouth Bay Colony. And the Plymouth Colony Massachusetts, probably which became later, merged with in 1690 Massachusetts, which was settled later. And while on board the ship that was carrying them from England to what became to their destination, which turned out to be Massachusetts, the men on board the Mayflower ship wrote what was called the Mayflower Compact. I used to years ago on the multiple choice, I would give a variety of questions on my tests, essays to test their breadth and depth of knowledge, whether they could not only memorize what it is I had taught and what they had read, but how they could explain it. Could they explain it to me, the reader of an essay, as though I knew nothing about the essay? The mark of a good essay is that the writer of the essay presumes his reader knows nothing about the subject. He wants to explain it to the reader as though the reader knows nothing about it, presuming nothing. That's the mark of a good student. Can you explain the material to someone who knows nothing about the material? That separates the A student from the B student, from the C student, from the D or failing student. Do you A, know the material? You ought to know it, know what it means, then explain it. I would have essays, false questions, I fill out the wonderful fill in the blank questions. And a lot of students drew blanks because they had not studied the material. And I would have multiple choice questions, some of them, and those were designed to force students to choose from among to reason their way through to the correct answer. I would change slightly the wording of what I had said in class or how things were phrased in a book to see whether they could discern, whether they could recognize it if it took a slightly different form. Reason their way through. This is how you separate the good students from those who aren't. From those, life is about discrimination, just discrimination. We're not all equally gifted. We're not all equally intelligent. We're not equally talented in certain fields, abilities. Some are linguists, I'm not. Some are gifted in math, I'm not. Some have a good memory. I have a fairly decent memory still at my age. It's fairly decent. Not as good as it used to be, but it's still fairly decent. It's a gift. My daughter has a better one than I do, than I ever had. That's frightening. It's far better than I ever had. And I had a pretty decent one. And we all have different, some are athletic, artistic, musical ability. Some can sit down at a piano and play a tune. I remember one time I was walking through the cafeteria at Mohawk Valley Community College in Utica, New York, and a student there was playing things by ear. I mean, didn't have any music. He was playing, and so I said, now this is 1976. And so these students, some of them were born in 1958, 59, so they're only a few years younger. It's between 5 and 7 years younger than I was at that time. And a lot of them were around 6 years younger than I was. And him, some of them, most of them are still alive, I'm sure. And one student was playing, and as we're playing things people would ask her to play, as far as I play Wagon Train, and she would dun 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 dee dee dee. I mean, amazing. It just people are music. They hear things, sit down, they can play. That concept. These are gifts, but all of us have the same gifts. We each have different gifts, different talents. And you separate the good students from those who don't have that ability. Doesn't mean they're favored any less than God, not at all. But it certainly means that there is a distinction. Employers discriminate who to hire, who not to hire. That's discrimination. Sometimes it's just, sometimes it's arbitrary, sometimes it's insidious. But people discriminate, they go to a restaurant. They want this meal instead of that meal. People don't think life is about just discrimination, but in the Mayflower, I would describe what the Mayflower Compact was. What was the Mayflower Compact? And one of the choices I would invariably give, and any of you of my former students who found these videos will recall this, I am sure, because they frequently got little rolls of Snickers when, not the candy, I don't like chocolate, but little waves, ripples of Snickers would go out, or sometimes guffaws, when they would see what was the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was a miniature moving truck, Mayflower Moving Company, anyhow, on board the Mayflower. The men on board, the Pilgrim men on board the Mayflower, drew up a compact. The social contract we spoke about with Locke, well, they drew one of these up in writing. The Mayflower Compact is very important because it is the first example of a written constitution in the experience of what would become American government, the government associated with the United States of America, the English colonies. They set down in writing their expectations as to what they wanted from their government. And this government was to be founded on very specific religious principles, false religious principles, the principles of Calvinism. And the presuppositions of the Mayflower Compact were almost identical to what I had gone over when discussing John Calvin a few lectures ago on Monday, November 19th, 2012, the feast of St. Elizabeth of Hungary and the commemoration of Pope St. Pontianus. Man is evil. The Calvinist precept of man was evil. Man could do no good. Man was evil. He was totally corrupted by original sin. Secondly, the second presupposition that went into this Mayflower Compact was that no government was legitimate unless it was created by and with the consent of those who were governed. And that is, as Locke had taught, men would have to give their consent to be governed. We don't give our consent. You see, this is the fallacy. We don't give our consent to be governed by God. God is a majority of one. We must assent and recognize His sovereignty over us. Men can disagree about the structures by which they are to be governed. They have wide latitude. Holy Mother Church recognizes men have wide latitude in the structures, these specific structures of government. But insofar as creating a government, governments exist. Governance as such is of God. There's a hierarchy in things. God over us, God and His Holy Church over us, the priest over the laity, husband lovingly over wife, husband and wife together over the children, employer over employees, teacher over the students, manager or sports coach over the players. There's a hierarchy in life. We don't live in egalitarianism. So they believe, no, men must give their consent to be governed. And they believed, as Calvin did, man's soul was predestined, that nothing man did on the face of this earth could essentially change the fact of his predestination. The arbitrary God had destined some people to heaven and some people to hell, and nothing anyone could do on the face of this earth could change it. Now, as Catholics, we understand there is a Catholic concept of predestination. God knows everything. God exists outside of time and space. But we believe the divine foreknowledge of God coexists with the reality of human free will. And there have been different explanations of this. The Thomists have one explanation. The Duns Scotists have another. Of the coexistence between God's divine foreknowledge and human free will. But God is not an arbitrary God. You see, God, living outside of time and space, knows the prayers that we are by our free will is going to say. And he knows, for example, once the soul has died, he knows all of the prayers that will be said for that soul. And they'll be at a time, which all goes into the rendering of the particular judgment on that soul. And whatever time that soul has to spend in purgatory. All there. But Calvinists believe, the Pilgrims believe in an arbitrary God. In a God who preordains people for heaven or hell, and nothing they can do can change anything. Therefore, it is the purpose of, as I indicated in an earlier presentation, the purpose of the civil government to separate the saved from the damned. How you do this? Well, you do this, the government does this by creating so many laws and strictures as that only the virtuous, only the saved could possibly obey. Regulating every aspect of human existence. And the preaching of the Calvinists was designed to exhort people to obey the civil law. There was the subordination of the church to the civil state. One of the fundamental errors of Russia, of orthodoxy, and thus of the Protestant Revolution. What was the determining sign by which men could tell the saved from the damned? Material success was a sign of divine election, and from that day to the present day, those influenced by Calvinism and its secular successor, emptied of the false theology, most Americans believe that the ultimate sign of their success in life is their material well-being, their prosperity. And the ultimate job of government is to assure them of their prosperity, of their economic well-being. That is the job of the civil government, as far as most people is concerned. Liberals believe in statism, collectivism, redistributionism, the confiscatory tax power, regulatory power of the civil state. Conservatives believe in the power of the private hand of the marketplace, the invisible hand, the private marketplace, entrepreneurial capitalism. The church does not condemn good business practices. She does not condemn those who make wealth honestly, who make money honestly, as I've indicated. She does condemn the reduction of the totality of human existence and human identity to the pursuit of wealth. And in fact, Father Fahey quotes Daniel Defoe's The Complete Tradesman by saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, by saying there's quite a difference between an honest man and an honest businessman. Because in business, one must cut corners to sell one's products. That's a paraphrase. That's of the essence of Calvinism. To seek wealth as an ultimate end in and of itself. And when they arrived here, being met by the Indians around harvest time, they gave thanks for their safe voyage, but they also gave thanks for being in a land that, as far as they knew, as I've indicated in an earlier lecture, they were in a land where there had never been any offering of the Mass before. Now, they were wrong about that, because the Mass had been offered in the Americas dating back to the 15th century. The Mass had been offered in North America dating back to 1565 in various points thereafter, in different parts, in Texas, Colorado, Virginia, New Mexico. In New Mexico at the beginning of the 17th century, about 17 years before the arrival of the Pilgrims, so-called, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, I once heard a fully traditional priest praise the Pilgrims. These virulent anti-Catholics, idiocy, pardon me, ignorance of history, inexcusable ignorance of history. These men hated the faith. They thought they were creating the new Zion in the wilderness. And the imagery of the 17th century was of making a god out of the settlement, the Puritan. But the Pilgrim and the Puritans both believed this, because they both believe essentially the same thing. They're Calvinists. The Puritan belief that America, even though it wasn't the country of the United States of America, but America, was to be the shining city set on a hill. John Winthrop's language, the preacher, John Winthrop's language of the early 17th century, the shining city set on a hill, quoted repeatedly by Ronald Wilson Reagan, who popularized this. George Bush, George Walker Bush, the son, George the Lesser, Bush the Lesser, said blasphemously, and the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it, referring to this country. Blasphemer. Blasphemer, George Bush. How can you vote for this man? This blasphemer. But Gore was worse. Don't vote for either of them. Don't vote for any of them. Who says you got to vote for these clowns? The lesser of two evils. I handle that in my lectures on the election process. Please. You want to believe that? You believe that. You answer to Christ the King for that nonsense. But it's nonsense. You're an idealist, Droleskey. Fine. I'm not an idealist. I'm a Catholic. The martyrs insisted on Catholic truth. So must we to the point of our deaths. Anyone who thinks we're making progress in this land, just take a look around you. Take a look in that store. Take a look at how maybe babies are being killed every day. You think we're making progress? You think we can make progress in the voting booth? Fine. You believe that. It's not the truth. You want to live in fantasy land, Tomorrowland, you live in fantasy land and Tomorrowland because it is a fantasy. It's a complete delusion, having nothing to do with reality. George Walker Bush said the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness, referring to this country, taking Reagan to the next step beyond. Blasphemer. Christ the King is the light who shone in the darkness, and the light will never overtake Christ the King. He will shine forth despite the blasphemies of Americanists, Calvinists and neo-Calvinists, of American exceptionalists. It is the Catholic Church which is the new city set on the hill. The shining city set on the hill, the new Zion, the new Jerusalem, not the United States of America. We love our country, but we don't idolize nationalism. The idolatry of one nation is a sin. True patriotism wills the good of one's nation, which is her Catholicization. That's why Our Lady came to Guadalupe. But the North American martyrs shed their blood was to Catholicize this land. Every bit of its culture, without exception. We don't have to compartmentalize our faith and keep it quiet. Yet it was when the first Catholics arrived in Maryland in 1632. They were told by the Jesuit priests, I believe his name is Father White, before they landed, that they were to practice their faith, but as quietly as possible, so as not to disturb their Protestant neighbors. Where did that get them? Not too far, because within about 60 years or so, there'll be persecution of the Catholics in Maryland. Practice your faith, but as quietly as you can, so as not to disturb the Protestant majority. And that's the story of Catholicism in this country from that day to this. Sure, converts were made in the 19th century, principally by marriage. Sure, Catholic schools were established, and there was evangelization work of the Indians being done, to be sure. But the conversion of this nation to the true faith was never on the agenda of John Carroll and those in James Cardinal